NBA. No, the NWBA. What's it called for basketball?
WNBA.
WNBA, Women's National Basketball. That's not the
Do you
punchline.
think if we just perform like Stefan and I define gravity, you'll get 100%?
Yeah, probably.
I'm
Okay.
to try.
So my presentation is on the history of the women's rights movement. The labor statistics in 1900 showed that 26% of the workforce was female, 1% of the lawyers in the country were female, and 6% of the physicians in the country were female. As opposed to 1989, when 60% of the workforce was women, 29% of the lawyers in the country were women, and 24% of the physicians were women. Between 1848 and 1900, we had the Seneca Falls Convention, which was run by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott. 68 women and 32 men signed the Declaration of Sentiments there. The National Women's Suffrage Association was started in 1869 by Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton in order to gain voting rights for women. In 1893, Colorado became the first state to actually give women the right to vote. And over the next 25 years, 15 other states would follow suit. And in 1896, the National Association of Colored Women was formed. Between 1900 and 1950, we had the National Women's Trade Union League start, which was to improve wages and working conditions for women. We had the Federal Women's Suffrage Amendment passed in 1819, which had been written by Susan B. Anthony and actually introduced in 1878. In 1920, the 19th Amendment was signed into law, and in 1921, Margaret Sanger started the American Birth Control League, which is now what we call Planned Parenthood. In 1955, the Daughters of Bilitis was formed, and they were the first lesbian organization in the U.S. They started as a social group, however, they became political over time and created a few laws. In 1960, the FDA actually approved birth control to be used by women for the first time, and the Equal Pay Act was passed in 1963. Then we had Griswold v. Connecticut, which struck down the last state law prohibiting contraceptive use by married couples, and then Eisenstadt versus Baird, which gave the right to privacy to an unmarried person, the allowance to use contraceptives. And lastly, Roe versus Wade, which gave women the right to a safe and legal abortion. Also, Title IX was passed in 1972, which gave schools the right to persecute anyone who's discriminating against gender. From 1990 to the present, we had Planned Parenthood versus Casey, which reaffirmed the Roe versus Wade Act, and then we had multiple other Supreme Court cases during that time, which highlighted wages, working conditions, and other types of discrimination that was happening. We also had the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Restoration Act, passed in 2009 by Obama, which gave women the right to bring grievances about unfair pay within 180 days of that happening. And also, in 2013, they struck down the ban on women in combat roles. However, most parts of that will not take place until 2016. And currently this year, we had our first two women to graduate from Army Ranger School. They were Lieutenant Kristen Grease and Captain Shay Herbert. Some important names are Susan B. Anthony. She was a teacher in an all-girls school. She campaigned for married women's property rights and was an American Anti-Slavery Society member. Elizabeth Cady Stanton followed her, and she was one of the foremost women's rights activists and philosophers of the 19th century. She was married to an abolitionist and campaigned for African American rights as well as women's rights. She was pro-marriage and divorce law reform and education and clothing reform, because during that time women were not allowed to wear anything except for dresses in the workplace. And lastly, Ida B. Wells. She was a journalist and an anti-lynching activist. She wrote for Memphis's Black newspaper, their only one, and talked a lot about the Jim Crow laws. However, she was forced to leave Memphis after threats to her life. She also walked at Woodrow Wilson's inauguration, even though she was asked not to because of her views on African American equality as well. There are still a lot of problems facing women today. The education reforms still cause discrimination in sporting and other things. The sex slave trade is a multi-billion-dollar business, and also college rape has become a big issue. 3 in 5 women will be sexually assaulted while they're in college. Now, why should you care? 50% of the workforce today is women, and over 50% of the population of the United States is women. They're creating the laws and other things, so if we treat them unfairly, they're going to treat other people unfairly, as well as the fact that our future children are going to be affected by all of these things. This is also really important because all of these women not only fought for women's rights, but they also fought for African American rights and other minority rights, which is something that a lot of people don't know. And that is the end of my presentation. And now we can stop the camera. And you're all welcome for that little bit of entertainment.